Okay. You there?
Yes,
Here we go.
hello.
Hi. So now I've put some kind of funny filter on. Let me try to get that off. Oh, I've turned this around is what I've done. Ah, we've done it. Hello. Thank you
Hi,
to
Deb.
everybody for your patience. Do you want to do the introduction, Tricia, or do you?
Well, okay, hello everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us in these difficult times. I know that Rachel at Lane Cove is watching as well. We were trying to bring her in to give an introduction to this session. I think it's kind of timely that we're doing something using digital media, and lots of people in the industry are trying to find ways to reach audiences and to continue with interaction. And I think that for both Deb and I, so I currently have an exhibition at Lane Cove Gallery called Digital Materiality. And this talk about hybrid materiality was, we thought would be an extension of that. What we thought was interesting was how Deb and I felt that we could contribute to this notion of digital hybridity, material, what am I talking about? Hybrid materiality. Yeah.
You got there, you got there.
Sorry,
it's all good.
I've been in a tech scramble for 10 minutes, so my brain will come back into focus in a moment. Within my practice, I think about digital technologies as one of my materials, and I think there's an interplay between the physical and the digital elements there. And so, Deb, although your work in curation is also dealing with digital, could you talk about the relationship between the physical and the digital in your practice?
Yeah, of course. And I want to thank you and Rachel both for inviting me to speak today. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege for me to do so. We've got a lot of people coming in on the feed here. I can see people I used to work with at Powerhouse. I can see some of the Gallery Lane Cove people coming in, so I feel confident that we have sorted the tech out. So we can do a collective sigh of relief. In terms of my practice, I think anybody that knows me or that's worked with me or been taught by me, which I also consider working together, the point of hybridity is kind of between, it's that material, non-material. So our students, Tricia, and the cohort that we met through, the two labs that we met through, I think they're really touch points for this kind of hybridity, this materiality that's not a material, but we wouldn't really understand how it's not a material unless we understood how materials worked. So that tension between you and I and our relationship and the way that we've worked together for the past 6 years almost now, I think it's a really beautiful tension, and I think it's captured really well in the show.
And so the labs that Deb's referring to is the Creative Robotics Lab and the Interactive Media Lab. So
yep.
Both of those spaces are playing between the digital, but in both of those contexts, I really did feel when I joined UNSW that my background in sort of haptic, in a haptic space, and the materials space could make a big contribution. So thinking about the humanities approach to the digital, let's say.
And I think that's a nice segue into the touch point that I have in my practice, because though I don't know how to code or build, I'm definitely not an engineer. I sort of touch onto design as that human point of human-centered design or human-computer interaction. So I think that those kind of crossovers where we're both concerned with that human touch point, and yourself a little bit more even in terms of how people might use the things that you're designing or the things that you're making. Because I know we talked a little bit last night about this, how design often solves problem and art is more the exploration of it in an experimental framework. I think where we're at UNSW Art and Design, and where we're at in terms of both of those labs, and even the lab, one of the labs that we're still building, is always looking at that touch point of of how can these non-materials or these hybrid materials engage with humans, and in what ways?
Yes. So for those people who aren't familiar with my practice, so Deb's primarily working as a curator and doing a lot of work with digital spaces. So I think that involves designing interaction in a lot of cases, but in that sense, a far more physical sort of interaction than a typical human-computer interaction sort of sense. And so in my practice as well, I consider that engagement with materiality is more like designing, or the engagement with designing an interface is more like a systems thinking approach. And so materials are all part of that process. And I think part of the notion of a kind of hybridity between a digital and a physical is also not overlaying your thought process as a designer onto materials, but really letting the physicality of the materials speak and have a voice within that. So materials become live actants within any sort of process.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add from your?
I think in terms of like the materials processes and the materials kind of systems that you're talking about, I see those mirrored all the time in the way that I watch students make, in the way that I watch their tutors and lecturers make and then pass on to them. And then also in the way that the materials themselves are designed, both the electronic systems, the software systems, and actually the physical systems where those two get their inspiration from. That's what actually really captures my imagination, and what I try to engage when I put on an exhibition, or I'm asked to help people prototype their works through the medium of exhibition. So we most recently did this, you and I did this together. Actually, it's a really seminal relationship for me, our relationship, because it helped me prove the criteria for curating interactive art as part of my PhD. And then we were able to follow that up with interviews with you and with other specialists, with your work as kind of that touch point that crossed over in this hybrid way. And also we then participated and exhibited together in the Human Robot Friendship Ball through the Connection at Rhodes, where there was there's a digital screen there and a digital gallery space where you then put up some of your works to create and evoke conversations. So I think that even the way that we're working with artists in these kind of, like as a curator, working with an artist, so our relationship is representative of a broader networked system of relationships that make these conversations come about through platforms like exhibition or making or evaluation.
Yeah, and if I think about the discourse around sustainability in terms of textiles and how the digital might be contributing to that, I mean, it's high on everybody's agenda, the fashion industry, and so textiles being very heavily involved with that is, you know, the second largest polluter. And so students need to think about these kind of ecologies when they're designing, rather than be that designer that is focused on, here's this object, this in the case of fashion, the fashion industry, here's this artifact that I'll mass produce. Rather, they need to be thinking, you know, of the full life cycle of a product. Yeah. And so I guess part of my practice is revealing this kind of life cycle from the beginning of where a material comes from, and how that is sustainable right through to its transformation into some kind of artifact. And I guess that process becomes quite visible. But strategically, one of the other things that I'm quite interested in is giving materials a voice, letting them speak within the practice, but also engaging in these kind of natural systems, co-designing with them. So that could be in the sense of, so the works that are in the gallery, one of them picks up on the weather data and your activity and translates stepping into knit stitches, and in that way it then
you can kind of see it there. It's a little bit in the shade. You can kind of see it.
there's quite a nice feed from the Gallery Lane Cove Facebook page. There's a bit of activity there that shows some of the works that I'm referring to, and another one gleans your sleep data and transforms that. So that the data that I'm feeding from my body or from the environment, it's also not a conscious thing that I make a choice about and then type it into a computer. The notion is to just kind of plug the body in or plug the environment in, and then those things become actants within a changing work, which is always very dynamic and very related to where it's happening and who it's happening with. So you end up with different results. So we could say that in that regard, even though these are very individual, labour-intensive and bespoke pieces, which might say something about my character, there's not really any reason why it couldn't be a completely automated function. And so then we're talking about manufacturing systems which are very agile and very connected to their local environments and their local sort of playing as part of the ecosystem, let's say.
I think there was a few threads there that I wanted to pick up on. So when you're talking about the life cycle of designing and making, realizing a work, somebody buying it and using it, it strikes me that fashion was originally, like if we're talking about the textile side of your design, your design practice, sorry, I just got a little, originally fashion started out as one-offs. It was very, very, kind of elite and very special. So originally, I think it was really only the mass production side of things that then it became problematic, like everybody wanted one of those. I know we talked a little bit last night when we were going through about a show that I worked on with Alison Gwilt called Fashioning Now, which was a whole symposium, and there's a book on how to better practice sustainable fashion. So the conversation has been out there for a really long time. We did that show, I think, back in 2000, like around 2010. And so that then was still being thought about. And to me, I feel like we're still having a similar conversation where we're looking at the way that things are designed. We're trying to find a way to move between materials in order to solve some of those bigger human problems. So the design aspect of things is coming into play where we're problem solving, but at the same time, we're having a look at engaging and indulging in the creative side of things. So for me, your practice is just sitting right on that cusp of trying to solve those problems as well as deliver an enjoyable product or an enjoyable engagement if you're thinking more about the artistic side of things, which is how we engage. So I've never like put on my Fitbit and like gone and done one of your sweater hikes and got a sweater out of the generative textile system. I've never come and done a sleep lab with you, but I have worked with you in a gallery space, and the way that you work, it's so much about knowledge production. It's about looking at systems and thinking things through and asking people what they think about the systems. And you are quite tireless about these things, like you've made it, obviously you've made an entire career out of it. And even that career is hybrid because you're putting on shows and you're doing all of those things that artists actually do, making connections with galleries like with Rachel at Gallery Lane Cove. And you're putting on shows and you're writing about them and being in catalogs and being online and you're being there, you're being an artist, you're inspiring everybody with your work. But then you actually go home at the end of the day and you sit down and you read and you write about it, and then sometimes you teach about it. And then other times you're publishing about it and questioning all these things. So this is one of the layers that I'm talking about, is that you are an example of material hybridity, or digital hybridity, or whatever we're talking about. It has these ripple effects, and it creates these ecologies of culture and these ecologies of learning and these ecologies of making in every community that you touch. And I think that that's a really important thing to kind of bring forward on the thread that you were just talking about.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that has been a progression through my career. So my master's is in public art, and then within that space I was always very much interested in community practice and practices of community. And similarly in the role in teaching, I find that it's forming communities of makers and making, and then then that's where my practice also has some kind of connection to the movement in maker spaces and these kind of
yeah.
And another reason, I guess, why this kind of approaches to making a system could not be then, you know, they can be shared and they can grow and they can pop up and be produced at any location, let's say. So rather than thinking of a sustainability approach as one that just simply looks back into the past and does things the old way, such as pre-mass production, rather there's lots of movement in. So there's a company, there's lots of companies doing lots of amazing work in this space in both materials and in the way they're producing. But you know, body scanning means we can make things that fit people, that are very bespoke. But there's a company called Unspun who are attempting to make jeans out of a single thread, which then can be unravelled in a single thread. They've collaborated with a company which is developing dissolvable thread. So at a high temperature, it means your garments can be deconstructed and then, you know, single source, single origin materials, so that things can be recycled or repurposed. So there's a mashup between reaching to the knowledge and skills of past traditional crafts practices, artisans practices, and then also leveraging that. So within my practice, I'm really interested in the relationship between a material and a tool, and have been very challenged in the digital age of mass production of widgets, which are exactly the same with materials that have no life. Because where's the conversation to be had? And that's the start of any work for me. So by analysing how people work with materials and crafts practitioners and their engagement with stuff, I'm interested in evolving machinery and tools which has that same kind of dynamics and interface and can be so agile and adjust to meet whatever parameters. So it's a similar logic that overlays my production, the way I teach, you know, the whole range gambit of things.
Yeah, and I think that's actually really evident in the work that you're doing. It reminds me, some of what you're talking about there is reminding me of a show that was on at the Powerhouse not too long ago called Out of Hand.
Yes.
And it was curated by Matthew Connell, and probably other people too, but he's the curator that I know that did it. And there's a beautiful catalog that people can order. But there was a few works in there with sustainable fashion, and you know, Matthew and I know each other for a long time, but he was my boss at the Powerhouse for a little while. But he's a very sort of maths, science, logical person, and he had to incorporate fashion into his show because there are enough case studies of sustainable fashion practice that are being produced in this alternate way, like with printing, materials printing. There was a dress there that you could print and it comes up in a little square and then you open it. But because of the body scanning you were talking about, it fits your body perfectly and comes out click, 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 click. And it fits you. So there's all these technologies going forward that are looking at different ways to use materials. So maybe not eradicating it entirely, but actually closely looking at people and what they need instead of producing for like a global mass.
Yeah, one of the other research projects that I'm involved with is with Sean Blamier and Patrick Spice, also at UNSW.
I love this project.
Yeah, well,
I love
it's
this
in
project
early
so
days,
much.
but we're looking at DNA cloning spider silk, and then I'm thinking about the wearable applications of spider silk. So it's got absolutely amazing properties, and some of them I'm discovering through the process of working with real spider silk. And so, for example, we know it's really strong, really lightweight, all sorts of amazing things. But a property I didn't know about is it's kind of, I wouldn't say agoraphobic, but when I'm trying to thread a little needle with it, if I wet it, it shrinks, it just crimps up amazingly. And I think, wow, this is like a switch, you know, this is such a property that could be really appropriated in new ways. Similarly, its conductive ability. So here we can go back to a natural material, because involving technology is almost the antithesis of sustainability in many ways, because of its reliance on all of that stuff, which is ending up in massive waste piles and using
it's hidden production,
non-renewable
so it's not
resources.
just the software.
But it's also a kind of a thought process. You know, we weren't able to imagine the scale of things we can imagine, because now we can link to big data. We can also link to minute worlds that are microscopic, and I mean that's kind of enables us to think in expanded or alternate ways, the way we can view things from a different perspective. So at the same time as, you know, it's changing our means of knowledge production, it's coming back and changing the way we think and the way we behave. So I could easily claim that I didn't have any affiliation or association with where this mass-produced garment had come from. But these days we can't really get away with that as easily, because we know it's been mass-produced somewhere, and we see the images, and we see, you know, we have a connection to it that we can't just, you know, sort of step away from.
I agree that the availability of information has also made everybody incredibly responsible for the way that we use the planet. And I think that this is actually something that's on everybody's minds right now. You know, I know that we were having, again, last night, a little chat about the hidden production behind our computers and behind our phones, all of the things that that happen to make us be able to do things like this, you know. So here we are in isolation. But we can still broadcast to all of my followers if they want, all of Gallery Lane Co's followers if they want, and the ability to do that, and the server farms that are needed for that, and the way that our phones are made from mined products. You know, it boggles the mind to think of what we need in order to get here, but it's also hopefully like a plan for the future. And I think that you know, because we're living that kind of future that people were thinking about before, which is why we have it. But I think in terms of one of the things that you just said that really kind of rung true to me was that we wouldn't know the things that we know if we hadn't come this far. So we can't learn about what we know about if we hadn't come on this journey. So now it's all about repairing the journey. Now that we have the knowledge.
I thought I might say something about the research that I've just begun, which is linked up with the Museum of Arts and Sciences, and also with both the labs we talked about at UNSW. But it's working with ethnic minority craftspeople in China, and then that expands to other craftspeople. And it's about looking at gestures. And so I've come up with a way to track, me and a whole lot of people from those labs. But the idea was to use colour stamped false fingernails. And so we used robotic colour sensing cameras, because I was trying to come up with a way to track movement and hand gesture, but it can't have any interference on the body if you're a craftsperson, and working with materials is such a haptic experience. Also, to be able to record these gestures in remote and you know, offline, maybe not even power communities. So I was based in Hong Kong for 7 years prior to joining UNSW. And through that time started working a lot with Shenzhen, with the manufacturers over there, and then gradually penetrated deeper into China. And now I'm working with Guiyang, a college in Guiyang, and they have great connections to the vast number of ethnic minority groups in that area. So I've been working with horsetail embroiderers who are the Shu minority, and there's about 1,000 women still practicing this amazingly detailed craft. And so I've gone in and been using, giving them these color-coded, very tech-looking, but false fingernails. So leveraging a kind of beauty technology that they're happy and familiar with. and basically triangulating and capturing with leap motion cameras and with the color sensing cameras in order to draw patterns of gestures. And, you know, thinking about the way that kind of information and knowledge is transferred as a, you know, it's more like learning to dance than it is. So again, it's, I might just go back many years. First of the very first wearable technology project that I worked on, we was a system to sort of bypass conscious thought, where I connected a body, let's say biodata, up to an operating system. So that was I electroplated false eyelashes. So you can see here's this progression of this beauty technology sort of idea, and also then used conductive ink eyeliner. And so someone wearing these had then became, basically they had an on and off switch with their eyelashes, which then, you know, connected to a headdress. And, you know, if you were awake, the lights came on, and if you were, this was maybe 8-9 years ago now. And so inside this little headdress was masses of cabling. Every little LED has an in and an out cable. And there was, you know, the technology now makes it a very different sort of approach. But
I think there's a photo of it on my Instagram feed of you and Andrew trying to fix it. It was at the robot ball. Yeah, that's
right, because we showed it at the robot ball. So for me, the experiment was, what do I happen when I just collect biodata, connect my body? So without this conscious logic of I have to type code into you know, whether it's words, but I have to type a code in and then something is generated and something comes back. So what happens if we just kind of become a kind of hybrid with the computing a little bit? You know, the technology is going inside our bodies, pacemakers, all sorts of things. We are evolving so that we don't have to go through this thought process. So I also thought something like learning to knit, well, perhaps not learning to knit. If, like me, I learned by sitting next to my mother and being shown what to do.
Me too. Yeah, me too.
But if you're trying to read a pattern, then it is this logical system, this cognitive activity of coding something and decoding it in order to follow something. So rather the way that these women work is there's a time and a place, and there's a connection that's established, and there's a affiliation with the material, and then knowledge is imparted, and it's a little bit more like learning how to dance, let's say. And so this is the sort of perspective I want to bring to looking at an artifact, a piece of textiles. And in the case of the horsetail embroidery, that's intangible cultural heritage listed. So I think this making visual the intangible element of of this work is really interesting, but also then perhaps playing these gestures back. So perhaps the gestures are linked to sound files, the sound files are from their singing. How does that cognitively kind of stimulate someone in their older age who perhaps doesn't have the capacity to do it anymore? At the same time, how could that be leveraged in terms of teaching someone how to do a practice? They put the nail on and they try the gesture and they try to get the song right at the same time as picking up this practice. So it's kind of archival, a translation of that same logic into one of the pieces that was being made in the gallery, although not a lot's gone on there in the last 2 weeks. The works were to be in production while we were there, but we're hoping that when we open back up again that we'll then run out the last week then. So one of the pieces is a bedspread which has tilt sensors on them. And so there I'm trying to keep a textile substrate as much as possible. And Deb, I don't think you're familiar with this work. So
no, I'm just staring at the picture to see if I can see it. I've never seen that work before. No,
it's a new piece. So it's a double bed bedspread, and then the tilt sensors are made completely of fabric. And so the idea is also to avoid these digital components, so it's washable and comfortable, etc. But I can then model some kind of basically pull off the data points and have a kind of topography of somebody's sleep. And I'm imagining then using that as a sort of it's almost like capturing your unconscious overnight when you're not aware of whether you've slept well or moved a lot or whatever, that gets played back in a way like a kind of dreamscape afterwards. So I'm trying to leverage a similar sort of generative potential that's sort of subconscious in order to produce something poetic and something that you don't have complete design control over.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting because that's your second, maybe even there's more, work that looks at sleep and the way that you track your sleep, and the way that we rest, because so often we don't rest. None of us do, which is why we're all globally right now being forced to take a rest, because none of us do. We go too hard. And so I'm excited because I haven't seen that work before, but I can imagine the weight of it and the way that it feels, and feeling comfortable, like getting people to come through and evaluate it and have them feel comfortable enough to sleep, to let you evaluate them. Like, it's just incredible. Can you please put me on your ethics application? Because that sounds really great. And it's so timely. Like, there's so many people I'm talking to right now who are up in the middle of the night because they don't know what to do.
Yeah, and that's the story that came out of doing the body ecology work. So the works that are often performative, let's say, I wouldn't consider myself as a performer, but I'm demonstrating process, and things get generated through over the
and
time
tracking
of an
it.
exhibition.
Like, you're tracking it with the Leapfrog and you're archiving it. So you are performative. It's just not to a general public. Yeah.
But in contrast to making it a completely automated process that's invisible, the interaction and the conversation with people is where that really comes alive, whether it's the translation into the shape of a garment because of who I'm making it for, or whether it's because when I'm sitting weaving, which is this lovely, slow, meditative process, then gallery visitors come and tell me all about how they relate to sleep in society at the moment. And we have this situation of, we have, a society in a sleep crisis with a conflict between the sort of the journal time of the sun going up and down, the industrial alarm clock that goes off to send us all off to the factories, so that industrial time sense, and then the digital one where we're overstimulating ourselves with electric lights and keep staying up late at night, and so we end up as a society with a big health problem, which has been called social jet lag. And so we do this kind of binging all week of staying up too late, waking up too early, and then we tend to just sort of have a binge sleep on the weekend to try and catch up. That's the jet lag kind of approach. And there's lots of medical data sort of around the effects of that kind of lifestyle that we're living. It's interesting to see what happens at the moment now. People are flipping to working from home. Well, I'm not commuting 3 hours down to Sydney. It's making a big difference to just getting some sort of rhythm and routine and sleep patterns and things like that.
Yeah. That's incredible. I was thinking too of like that point where you're operating with people again, even though it's about their sleep and it's something where they might need to be asleep for you to connect with them or for your systems to connect with them. I think it's again coming back to that point, and it's what a lot of our students do and a lot of our cohort in the 2 labs do, is they're looking at that connection with people and they're asking them for their stories, and we're then working that into our research. You're also, Tricia, as an artist, you're futuring. Like you started this work. You didn't start this work a couple months ago when COVID started happening. You haven't done it in response to COVID. But the things that you were thinking about are becoming incredibly relevant, because that's what artists do. Artists are looking at the world around them and taking a measure. And because you're in that hybrid space of an artist and a designer, because of where you're sitting with textiles and technology, you're actually trying to solve problems through experimental practice that you see might become relevant because of all your research and because of your finger on the pulse. And then like it's actually my absolute privilege to then create like a living lab environment where people can come and engage with those works. And Rachel's doing it too. I mean, my God, Rachel's got all your work there in her gallery right now. And I think that's Rachel having her finger on the pulse. That's her knowing what she's doing as well.
So you also might be onto me there, Deb, because another one of the observations about the sleep work is that it's actually colonising the one domain, the one bastion which wasn't consumed by capitalist production, which was sleep.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
in this sense, I go to sleep and I'm working. So, you know,
They
maybe
got you now.
yeah, there you go. I'm producing something from my sleep. So in production, Marx would be horrified or love me. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Love. All love.
Yeah. I think it would be really nice if any of the people watching have anything they would like to text in some sort of queries or questions or ideas that we might be able to pull into our discussion. Since we've covered we've covered hybridity, hybrid practice, hybrid materials, digital
art.
media, interactivity, and sustainability in our own ways.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think we've got across the core topics. And let's see if we get any spike from that call out. I feel like I'm radio DJ.
Any questions? I know, right?
Is anyone even still there? You're the one on the feed.
Or teaching an online course. Anybody?
Yeah.
Anybody there? I'm excited to see. Have you got any other shows set up, Trish, after the Gallery Lane Cove?
I'm working toward to be announced because the funding's not secure yet, so we don't quite know.
Don't give away secrets. Don't give away secrets.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Linking up some of the things with the project I was talking about with the nails, and the bedspread work has just begun. I'll be doing this embroidery. It's using techniques from the horsetail embroiderers, and I'll probably be stitching it for 3 years. You know, like my practice is slow. My practice is really kind of ongoing. So watch this space for that one. That eventually will evolve into something. And right now I'm looking forward to editing a new kind of story, crafting a story around the discourse between these three pieces that are in the gallery space together, because it's so lovely to they're works that were made years apart from each other, but there's a narrative that I want to pull out. It's more like a kind of working factory in there, or factory that's on hold for the moment. In hibernation, is that what the government's using?
I think that's apt considering your work. You've got a question here from Rewa, right? Who also worked with us at UNSW Art and Design. It's more like a comment, really. Can you see it, Trish, or do you want me to read it to you?
You better read it. I can only see the last part of it.
So Rewa said, I was interested by your work on sleep because the bed is such a private space, and I think it's interesting that you're translating that body data into the more public sphere. Mm-hmm. Do you have any comments on that, Trish?
It makes me think, it just makes me reflect back on the notion that perhaps that unconscious, subconscious kind of realm is something we're not tapping into too well. So maybe, yes, it's the privacy into public. And in fact, the whole premise for setting up my wearables lab in Hong Kong in, I think, 97, dare I say? No, that's way too early, 2007, was that I'd come from this public art background. So the discourse between public and private is always this alive and kind of being negotiated space between public and private. And that's what, for me, made it really interesting. And so when I joined the wearables lab or set up the wearables lab, I wasn't interested in promoting myself to initially to get the privilege to set that up as a fashion designer. I came in and talked about that space between private and public, which was this layer around a body, a platform for discourse. And so, it's always been about that interaction. And so maybe I'm just still doing exactly the same thing.
Maybe, or maybe you're doing it. You're doing that beautiful slow progression of work that enriches the more that you engage with it. We've got another question here from Pat Eunice. Hi, Pat. And hi, Rewa. So Pat says, with the natural movement towards working remotely through the support of technology, and now with the added element of quarantine, is there a desire to be more nomadic to the sources of the mat used?
To the sources of the what used?
It says to the sources of the mat used.
The mat.
What do you mean, Pat?
Well, I can relate to the nomadic part, as it's also a big interest with wearables, and also this notion of a monad, you know, being able to material
of the material used is what he means. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Rachel. Do you want me to read it again? Do you want me to read it again?
I think that, so even works that I did a textile piece for the Tourney Textile Triennial many years ago, and it involved a hand-woven sort of plaid skirt from all base materials from cotton and silk, which made a kind of natural plaid colours or shades, and then it had a series of detachable pockets, and each pocket basically was a map of the local area, and the materials that it was made from was what I could find locally and what I could source locally, including the colours for making my dyes up to dye the textiles to make the map. So each pocket had a compass, and I collected a story from a local. So one of those was from Mongolia, and so he was a driver that we had when I was doing a trip up there. But his background was, he was still living, basically traveling around, living in a ger nomadically, and he'd had a job protecting the border with the army for a while, which was a really bizarre thing to do for someone who was nomadic. So a local story was embedded into this, but the notion was when you moved around, you could swap pockets. So there was a translating app. It was basically like having an iPhone in your pocket, and also a transit card was also part of the little kind of kit which was in each pocket, which became part of your costume, but then the part of what you could wear. So I think I've always been quite aware, even way before that in Australia, doing a piece. I had a country art support grant to make some works with Upper Hunter Valley communities, and one of the ones way out at Merriwa worked with 10 farming families, and I challenged myself to make a box with only what I could find. So I really love those parameters, and I also would only buy what I needed from the local hardware store as a way to also engage in a story with place, and engage the community in the process of that coming to life. So yeah, in my thesis I call that durational commitment, this kind of notion of going, developing, practice, sharing. But once I then set up a wearables lab in Hong Kong, all of a sudden I couldn't be the person who went and sat in someone's community for 3 months developing a project, and I started much more making artifacts which draw on all the data that gives me that, as much sense of connection to community that I can. So Pat, sorry, that was very, very long.
He put two encouraging. He put 2 encouraging comments in the thread to encourage you. So that was great. Thank you. Any other questions? I mean, Trish and I are quite happy to probably talk for ages.
Thanks, Pat. I could see that thread come through.
Oh, very good. Very good.
Yeah. Well, we're very close to wind-up time.
Yeah, we are.
So we might, unless we have other questions coming through, I'm sure Gallery Lane Cove's site is going to spread the word when we get the possibility to open back up. And in the meantime, let's try and challenge ourselves to be creative and work through these digital modes that we have to connect with each other and share and tell stories.
Yeah, and we are being very encouraged now by Gallery Lane Cove to do just that, to pop online and to take note of Tricia's amazing show.
Yeah,
as I said,
see it. Before the doors closed, there's some quite, I'm not going to say unprofessional, but casual photography that's been done that'll give you an insight to some of those pieces. And then I'll get in after that and try and craft something that I can, put up to live permanently online, so that that can talk more about those works. Yeah.
Beautiful.
So thanks everyone for joining us for this.
What a great experience. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for allowing us to do the talk online. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you, Tricia, for the invitation.
Yes. And thanks, Rachel, as well for setting all this up for us. So
yeah, it's fantastic. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Deb.